tuned in to Radio Gold. This production of The Avengers burst in the door of spy and superhero adventure drama on South African radio in 1971, starring Donald Monat as John Steed and Diane Appleby as the wonderful Emma Peel. It was based on the Fine TV series, which was very popular from the start in the UK, and is an excellent example of radio's adaptation of the television medium. Part pop art, part superhero, and part adventure serial, this radio show had all of the excitement and intelligence of the original television hit. National TV wasn't available in South Africa until 1976, so radio was the only way the Avengers was popularized there, rising to almost cult status. It was produced as usually 6 serial episodes per week, and the cliffhanging segments keep the action moving and always leading up to a thrill to be continued. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Radio Gold is proud to present The Avengers.
Now, from the makers of Cold Water Omo,
the Heron establishment of the Ministry of Technology, an almost ultra-modern building, is set in rural grounds, well back from the road, with lawns and shrubs all around it. It is always, of course, well guarded. On a certain evening, not so very long ago, the security guard on the main gate hitched up a holstered revolver over his very ample waist, surveyed the darkness, sighed, and began pacing the gravel. He glanced briefly towards the car park. A man, in a white laboratory technician's coat and carrying a small briefcase, left a car and walked casually towards the main building. Another car swung out of the car park, and the occupant waved to the guard.
Night! Night, sir!
When the guard turned back to the gate, he noticed that the white-coated figure had disappeared. The guard continued his idle pacing. In some bushes near the main building, a young man slipped off the white coat and pulled a black sweater with a knitted hood over his head. He then dropped to his knees and opened the case. Inside the case was a gleaming array of barrels, cartridges, bolts, and stocks. With almost magical speed, the young man assembled the parts into a very lethal double-barreled shotgun. He stroked it lovingly. His eyes hardened. They became the eyes of a killer. The eyes of the man who intended destroying poor George.
The Avengers. John Steed and Emma Peel, The Avengers.
Episode 1 of this story, in which John Steed, Emma Peel, and practically everyone else asks, who shot poor George /stroke XR40? The young man crouched low in the bushes. He broke the shotgun and inserted 2 cartridges, clicked it shut, and moved stealthily through the undergrowth. He merged into the shadows, making full use of the cover, checking his position with a thin-lipped smile of satisfaction. At a convenient point, he stopped and dropped to one knee. A light had gone on in a room in the research center. The window had a thin blind. On the blind Clearly silhouetted was the figure of a solidly built figure seated in a chair, a figure with an impossibly square head. A man moved forward as though to question the seated figure. Seconds later, the shotgun was raised, and a split second after that, the would-be assassin didn't stop to see the result of his work, but headed for the car park, while inside the room with the window blown to pieces, Baines, a senior programmer, stared down in horror at the dark shape on the floor. It was a man-sized and shaped computer, but its dials glowed only fitfully, and its mechanism was slowing down agonizingly.
Oh, no. No. Who done this to... Oh, George.
I came as quickly as I could.
This way.
I was about to go to a party. If this case doesn't take more than 48 hours, I may still be able to make it.
Some party?
I think so. I hope you dragged me away from it for something really important.
Oh, yes, really important. Murder. One of the top brains in the country.
Oh?
It could set us back years.
Well, that seems a pretty cold-blooded way of looking at it.
Well, he was rather a cold-blooded sort of fellow.
Calculating, too.
Oh, very calculating. In here.
It was the same room. The robot computer had now been laid out on the table. Two white-coated figures bent over it. It was an emergency examination. Dr. Ardmore, an expert in cybernetics, was in charge.
Not much more I can do here, Tobin. But any movement might upset the balance and prove fatal. We'll have to risk it. Get the theater ready. I'll operate within the hour. Yes, sir. Oh, good evening. Evening. Dr. Ardmore, Tobin, Mrs. Peel. How do you do? And there on the table is George, oblique stroke XR40, the most advanced electronic brain in the country.
A computer?
Yes. Containing the concentrated knowledge of more than 2,000 of the world's leading scientists.
Digital or analog?
Numbers or words, they are now perforated by a 12 bore aimed through their window. I wish I could say that I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Peel, but in the circumstances... I'm a cybernetic surgeon, by the way. This is a crisis. I'm afraid I can only spare you a few minutes. Oh, we quite understand. He looks in a bad way. A major op is our only chance. Any reason for this attack? Senseless destruction. Work of a psychopath. It must be.
Must have been a well-organized psychopath.
Better get him onto the stretcher. Give me a hand, Tobin. Yes, sir. On here, we can wheel him out. Yes, sir. Now, gently now. Gently. Yes, sir. What was that, Mrs. Peel?
The attack. It was obviously well planned. The shot through the window.
A cold-blooded murder. George XR never had a chance. More careful with him, you fool. Now, careful.
Oh, dear. All his, insides have come apart, haven't they? This wire any of you?
It could be vital.
Well, there's a lot more here, too. Wires of different colors. Green, blue, red. Mostly red.
Life's blood. Give them to me.
Yes, but there must be a difference between a spare part and a transplant, surely.
Was George working on any special project, Dr. Ardmore? Nothing strategic, if that's what you mean, Steed. A stress analysis for the Admiralty. That's right, isn't it, Tobin? Not quite, sir. Mr. Baines brought in a rush job late this evening. Baines? Who is Baines? One of our programmers. He's worked with George XR since the start. He was here when it happened, Mr. Steed. The tragedy, I mean. I see. Is he here now? No, he's off duty. Went home. Very cut up, of course. Of course. You've got a telephone number. I'd like to talk to him. Yes, you can get the number from reception. Thank you. Really, I don't want to worry you, but I must go and get scrubbed up. We can't leave George like this. Every moment is important. This is an emergency, and I must operate at once. Tobin, after you. Careful now. Yes, sir. Now, gently. You're not dealing with a mere dispensable human being. Gently. Oh, if you get in touch with Baines, you'll have to ask him to turn down his hi-fi. He's an addict. A very peculiar fellow, I'm afraid.
Would one peculiar fellow appear out of place in this organization, I wonder?
I shouldn't think so.
A hi-fi addict, How's your tympanic membrane these days, Steve?
Oh, no panic. In fact, it's booming.
Splendid. I'll leave Mr. Baines to you then and get back to my party.
Oh, no, you don't. You can't be so heartless as not to feel pity for poor George. Now, we can't very well leave him to face this major op alone. And do you realize something, Mrs. Peel?
What?
If they do get George a bleak stroke XR40 over this, and his wheels start turning again, he could pop out one or two answers.
Like the muzzle velocity of a 12-bore shotgun and the impact of a bullet fired through a glass window into a computer's chest? Would that really tell us anything, Steve?
Sometime after that, Steed and Emma Peel, back in London, entered her apartment. Steed wandered across to the drinks table, poured himself a liberal tot of whiskey, and reached for the telephone. He'd obtained the number of Baines's home without undue difficulty and proceeded to dial it. The number appeared to be ringing, but there was no answer. Steed thought Baines wasn't at home, but he was. The trouble was he couldn't hear the telephone ring. The reason? Well, he was a hi-fi addict. Of course, being a considerate man, Baines only listened through headphones so that he didn't disturb the neighbors. A man in his early 30s, he was slumped in an easy chair, stirring a cup of cocoa. He reached out a thin hand and turned up the volume on his set. The telephone ringing was lost in the cacophony of sound. Also lost upon the unsuspecting Baines was the sound of the door being slowly forced open. The shadowy figure of a young man slipped into the room, the same young man, incidentally, who'd been darting in and out of the bushes at the Research Institute earlier that evening. Baines smiled contentedly, his eyes closed. Yet another mistake. The young man approached the armchair from the back. His hand stretched out suddenly and turned up the volume on Baines's headphones to full. Baines shot to his feet, tore off the headphones, and flung them down. He swiveled around and found himself looking down the twin barrels of the shotgun that had been aimed with such devastating effect at poor George. Perhaps poor George was made of tougher metal after all.
Avengers.
Listen every evening, Monday to Friday, to John Steed and Emma Peel, The Avengers. Brought to you by the makers of Cold Water Omo. The Avengers. Donald Monat as John Steed and Diane Appleby as Emma Peel is adapted and directed by Dennis Falbig and produced by David Gooden.
Let's take a short intermission. The Best of Dimension X from Radio Gold. Dimension X was the first sci-fi anthology series to utilize published stories from established science fiction authors, which gave the series an instant status of credibility to hardcore fans. Stay tuned. Episode 2 starts in just a few seconds.
Now, from the makers of Cold Water Omo,
John Steed replaced the telephone in its cradle, sipped his drink, and looked at Emma Peel quizzically.
No one there. Baines, I mean.
Strange. Dr. Ardmore seemed sure that he'd go straight home to his hi-fi.
Yes. Dartmouth Park Road.
What?
Well, that's where he lives. North London, Tufnell Park.
Oh, well, that's very near my party. Tell you what, Steve, 2 birds with 1 stone. I'll call in on Baines on my way. How's that?
The Avengers. John Steed and Emma Peel, The Avengers.
Episode 2 of this story, in which John Steed and Emma Peel ponder over the question of who shot poor George Oblique-Stroke XR40. John Steed and Emma Peel had been called down to the Heron establishment of the Ministry of Technology to investigate a murderous attack upon one of their personnel, George XR40. George XR40 was a computer, one of the most advanced in the land. They had found him in a bad way. A 12-bore shotgun had been used at quite close range, and most of George's internal mechanism had caught the blast. Steed's first thought was not so much who had shot at George, but why. Checking up at the establishment, Steed found that the last person to see poor George in full working order, as it were, was a certain Charles Baines, one of the programmers. Baines's evidence could be important, but he didn't answer his phone. He should have been at home. Indeed, he was. He was lying slouched by an easy chair, an upset cup of cocoa seeping into his shirt, mixing with the red stain of blood that spread across his chest. Charles Baines was dead. Charles Baines had been dead for some time, yet he wasn't alone in the room. A young man was searching frantically through the hi-fi equipment, turning out long playing records from their racks, tipping tapes onto the floor, becoming more frantic as the minutes sped by. When Emma Peel walked into the flat and reached out to press the bell, she noticed the door was already open.
Mr. Baines! Mr. Baines!
Mrs. Peel entered the room, took in the whole confused scene at a glance, and the light went out. The young man attacked. Foolish young man. Mrs. Peel threw him across the room. He staggered against the many turntables, clutching at switches which started all sorts of tapes into action. Mrs. Peel moved towards the light switch, but the young man had enough. He bolted through the open door to safety.
Light on, and main plug out. Phew. Well, that's a relief. Hello, what's this?
As Emma Peel straightened up from removing the main plug in the wainscoting, she noticed a small envelope, partly hidden under the carpet.
A reel of computer tape, and written on the label, XR40. This has to be it. Oh, dear, what a mess this flat is. Honestly, Mr. Baines, if you could see the state of your hi-fi equipment right now, you'd just die.
headed back to the Heron establishment. In a white-tiled room, an emergency operation, which had been delayed due to a shortage of spare parts, was about to begin on George XR40. Due to the complex nature of the computer, it was essential that everything should be sterile. Dr. Ardmore was in charge when Steed arrived.
Gloves, nurse. It is essential that all who touch the patient must wear rubber gloves. The electronic transfusion, you understand?
Oh, quite.
A switch on the main arteries.
Very good, sir.
Light a little nearer. Thank you. Oh, it's nasty. I have to open him right up. Buttons. Yes, get to the heart of the matter. That's better. Clamps. Right. Stand by for soldering. Swab. Right. Electrocautery. It's rejecting the replacement. Nasty. Try again.
How's the pulse? A bit weak, sir. I can boost the voltage when you're through connecting up, sir.
Almost through. I'll need to open up another 3 inches. A straight incision about here.
Checking on the dial, sir. It's touch and go. The pulse very erratic. You haven't got long, sir.
All right, Tobin. I think I can just... What's it? Clamp. Swab. Suction tube. Right. Pincers. Screwdriver. I think that's it. All right, close him up.
Brilliant piece of surgery, old chap.
Touch and go, Steed, touch and go. Thank goodness it was George and not one of those digital types.
Any chance of a brief word with the patient?
What? Good gracious, no. This is only the emergency operation. We still don't know if we can pull him through. The shock to a mechanism as delicate as this.
Oh, well, yes, I understand.
You'll have to check the memory circuit, sir.
Mm? Oh, yes, very well. Switch over to pure AC. Half power to start.
Yes, sir. Responding. Pulse rate normal.
Full power. Right. We are checking on memory now. This should be interesting, Steed. Could be useful. XR should repeat the last thing he was working on. It should come from him in the form of a tape to recall. From the mouth to the brain. Here, this button. When I press it... Here comes the tape.
What does the tape say?
Incredible. Read it for yourself.
Help.
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 Help. Help.
Help.
Help. Pulse rate.
Failing. Can't hold it, sir.
Open him up. Quickly, man. Oh, poor chap. It just proved too much for him.
Dead?
Coma. It'll take electroshock therapy to bring him out of it. You'd better start setting up for it, Tobin.
Yes, sir.
Deplorable, lamentable.
Dr. Ardmore, this tape...
Yes?
After the heartfelt cries for assistance, there's something else here. Look. Help, 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 help. Pele. Now, what does that mean, a Pele?
What's that?
The tape. First help, and then Pele.
That's understandable. Sir Wilfrid Pele designed George XR40. In times of despair, what could be more natural than for George to remember who created him?
Well, I'm surprised in that case that you didn't get in touch with Sir Wilfrid immediately.
He's on leave, Mr. Steed. We tried to reach him, but apparently he isn't taking any calls.
Well, but surely in George XR40's hour of need...
We can but hope to get in touch. Although I doubt very much if even Sir Wilfrid could put matters right. Poor George. Poor George.
time after that, Mrs. Peel arrived, clutching the tape that she'd found in Charles Baines's apartment. Her first thoughts, of course, were for poor George.
How did the operation go, Steve?
The operation was a success, but the patient was a failure, I'm afraid.
Oh, too bad.
Ardmore did a good job, but the patient is in a coma. Every part of the mechanism is now defunct. They're going to try again later with electroshock treatment.
I see.
What's with Baines?
Someone got there first. A young man with a shotgun. I should think in the middle of the third movement.
Huh? Oh, hi-fi.
Beethoven's Fifth.
In the middle of the third movement. Before that dramatic run of lilting chords.
Just before.
Oh, what a terrible way to go.
Cut off in mid-stanza.
Right across the arpeggios.
But at least we know why he was killed. This tape. Baines used this to program George XR.
Ah, then you must stay near the patient, Mrs. Peel.
Oh?
A bedside vigil, my dear. If they manage to revive George, you can feed him that tape.
Where will you be?
Did you ever stop to wonder how poor George came into this world?
An electronic gooseberry bush?
To be precise, Sir Wilfrid Pelly's gooseberry bush. He's on leave, and I'm going to join him. Bye, Mrs. Peel.
Avengers. Listen every evening, Monday to Friday, to John Steed and Emma Peel, The Avengers. Brought to you by the makers of Cold Water Omo.
Let's take a short intermission. Nero Wolfe made his larger-than-life radio show debut on July 5, 1943. This intelligent detective show, based on the Rex Stout novels, proved to be a natural for classic radio. Throughout the show's run, Santos Ortega, Louis Van Rooten, Francis X. Bushman, and Sidney Greenstreet all filled the voluminous chair of Nero Wolfe. As well, a large assortment of actors played the part of every blonde's hero, Archie Goodwin. The Adventures of Nero Wolfe show remained popular on the airwaves in different versions for 8 years, from 1943 to 1951. Stay tuned for episode 3 of The Avengers.
Now, from the makers of Cold Water Omo.
Well, at least we know why Charles Baines was killed. This tape that I found, it's labeled XR40. Obviously, Baines used this to program George XR.
Then you must stay near the patient, Mrs. Peel. If they manage to revive XR40, then you can feed him that tape.
And where will you be, Steed?
Sir Wilfrid Pelly created George. He's on leave at the moment, but I'm going to join him. Bye, Mrs. Peel.
The Avengers. John Steed and Emma Peel, The Avengers.
episode 3 of this story, in which John Steed asks the inventor, Sir Wilfrid Pelly, who shot poor George Oblique-Stroke XR40. John Steed and Emma Peel had to agree that they weren't getting very far, very fast on the case of George XR40. The supercomputer was still on the danger list in spite of hours of skillful work by Dr. Ardmore, the cybernetic surgeon, and his assistant, Tobin. George XR40 had undergone a vital emergency operation. At first the team had high hopes that he'd rally round and make a full recovery. But poor George just wasn't strong enough to come through it intact. His delicate mechanism gave up. There he lay on the operating table, out of action, a feeble glow from his dials, his impulses flat, his current barely flowing. In fact, just about ticking over.
Well, he's just about holding his own. That's all I can say. The next 24 hours will be vital. He's had all the top treatment the computerized science can give him. There's only one real hope. That Steed can persuade his inventor, Sir Wilfrid Pelly, to return. The only hope, I'm afraid.
John Steed had motored down to Sir Wilfrid Pelly's country home at top speed. He found it without difficulty, turning into the gravelled drive and drawing up in front of the large Georgian entrance. Steed noted, as he climbed out of his Bentley, a gardener with a shotgun tucked under one arm, moving round the corner of the house. He registered the fact, although he didn't recognize the man. Perhaps Mrs. Peel might have done. Steed ran lightly up the stone steps and rang the bell. A few moments later.
Yes, John Steed. Did you get my message? The telephone from the heroin establishment.
Indeed, yes. That is, Steed. But I regret that your journey has been wasted. I'm afraid Sir Wilfrid has been forced to retire.
Forced? You mean he's ill?
Perhaps tomorrow?
Oh, ill, is he? Poor old boy. Well, I must deliver my...
Sir, I must ask you...
Don't ask me anything. I can never give the right answers. This way...
Sir, please.
Oh, thank you. Chaps like you are worth your weight in the family silver. Just take my coat, my hat, or my umbrella. Will you? There's a good chap. Thank you. In here, yeah? Ah, you must be Sir Wilfrid. Splendid. You know, your butler's quite pre-war. Don't breed them like that anymore. How are you, Sir Wilfrid?
Steed addressed his remarks to a tall, grey-haired gentleman who was sitting in an old, comfortable leather chair, staring pensively into the open fire. He was thin, but tanned. The type of elderly man one would expect to positively crackle with energy. But he merely looked up nervously at Steed's entrance.
Inform Mr. Steed that you were unwell and in the process of retiring, sir.
Oh, yes, I'm afraid that's true. I can't see you now.
Well, this shouldn't take a minute. It's about George XR40.
If you please, sir. Sir Wilfrid has made it quite clear that he doesn't want
Just a minute, Jason. George XR40, you say? Oh, in that case...
Won't take a minute, promise.
Well, perhaps a moment or two. It'll be all right. You do sit down.
Ah, thank you. Thank you, Sir Wilfrid.
Would you care for a drink?
Scotch with a breath of soda. Quite a drive down here. First to work driving.
How is XR40?
Critical. I'm afraid someone took a shot at him, Sir Wilfrid.
What? George shot?
Almost point-blank range. Took it in the middle.
Good gracious, in the middle, eh? Vital organs affected?
Totally.
Gracious. But why? Does anyone know why?
Not too wet.
Sorry, sir.
No, Sir Wilfrid, no one knows why. In fact, everyone's quite baffled. That's why we'd like your assistance.
Mine? How could I help?
Well, you did design XR, so there's no one better qualified to diagnose the damage.
Yes, but when...
He has been asking for you, sir.
Is that so? Is that really so?
Your Scotch, sir.
Ah, thank you. Well, cheers.
I think I'll have one, Jason.
It's rather later for you, isn't it, sir?
Scotch, Jason. Make it a double. At the double. Very good, sir. Ardmore is a good man.
Oh, yes, very, but he's already had a go. He's not the best. You are.
I'm sorry, Mr. Steed, very sorry, but it's out of the question.
Poor old George XR. You know, the only words he managed were help and Pelly.
That's so.
Your double scotch, sir.
Oh, thank you, Jason. No, Steed, I'm not giving up my holiday, not even for XR. Anyway, there are plenty of good men at the center, equally qualified. There's no necessity for me to return now.
I see.
No, I don't think you do see. I worked for 3 years on that project without a break. And before that, 5 years at Harwell, without so much as a day off. Pressures, indispensability. That's the trouble with the ministry, Steve. They treat one as though one were a computer. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I understand, Sir Wilfrid. But this is an emergency.
There are always emergencies, always extreme cases. No, I'm going to finish my holiday, Steve.
But surely, Sir Wilfrid, I can persuade...
No.
Is that your last word?
Yes.
Well, in that case, I won't bother you further. Good day, Sir Wilfrid.
Goodbye, Mr. Steed.
I'll see the gentleman out, sir. This way, Mr. Steed.
Sir Wilfrid made no further comment, but sat dejectedly by the fire, staring into the flames, as though regretting his decision, biting his lip, his thin hands turning the glass of whiskey nervously. He looked up only when Jason came back into the room and walked over to him. Sir Wilfrid raised the whiskey to his lips, but before he could drink it...
You behave yourself, you old fool.
Jason then walked swiftly out of the room and locked Sir Wilfrid in. Back at the Heron establishment, Dr. Ardmore had been forced to turn his attentions back to poor George. There was no doubt about it. The patient was sinking fast. Shock electrode treatment had been applied, but vital organs needed repair. Yet another attempt was to be made on the operating table.
Tweezers. Screwdriver.
Oh, not that big nurse. We aren't repairing bicycles. Sorry, Doctor.
Soldering iron.
Things still in a state of flux. Now, this is the important part. If I can but join up the two cracks, he just might have another chance. Swab. Thank you, nurse.
By the time Steed returned to the establishment, George XR40 was out of the operating theatre and resting quietly. Steed found Mrs. Peel in the waiting room.
Mrs. Peel, how is George XR?
Hanging on. The last thing at computers was 2 plus 2 equals 5.
You know, I've always suspected that.
It's something to do with his memory circuits. The official bulletin is very, very, very poorly.
What about the tape?
Well, just look at it.
Emma Peel held up the tape. It was punched full of holes.
Not the kind of thing one solves over a cup of coffee.
It appears to be a problem in tensor calculus.
Dr. Ardmore, do you suppose we could run this through another computer?
No, couldn't handle it. Too complex for anyone but poor George XR.
No chance of a lucid moment from him?
We'll try again later. But frankly, I'm amazed he's hung on so long. Shock, multiple lacerations, severe internal injuries, and of course almost no electrical circulation.
Yes.
Couldn't a team of mathematicians...
200 working for 50 years might make something of that tape. No, George is our only hope. He's capable of carrying out 2,000 separate calculations in 1 second. Imagine the shot that disabled him. From the moment it was fired, George could compute the range of velocity, mass kinetic energy, and impact ratio per cubic centimeter.
And just one thing he couldn't do.
What?
Duck.
Things may look brighter when Sir Wilfrid arrives.
I'm afraid Sir Wilfrid won't be arriving, Dr. Ardmore.
What's that?
He's full of the holiday spirit and determined to stay that way.
I can't believe it.
Well, it's all your own fault, apparently. You overworked him. Years here and at Harwell without a break.
Astonishing. George XR, death's door, and Sir Wilfrid. Harwell? What did you say, Harwell?
5 years without a day off.
But Sir Wilfrid never worked at Harwell. Never. Not ever.
Really? How strange. I'm sure he said Harwell. Now, why did he say that?
The Avengers. Listen every evening, Monday to Friday, to John Steed and Emma Peel, The Avengers. Brought to you by the makers of Cold Water Omo.
Now get on over to the Radio Gold channel and find the exciting 3-part conclusion to this adventure. Radio Gold is a 3 Nines Fine radio production. See you next time.